All right, good morning, good afternoon. What's new in adaptive physical education, listeners? It's been a while since we've talked, but I'm excited to have you all on, and we're having an episode on behavior management today. This is going to be one of 3 episodes on behavior management, and then also in the archives, I have an episode on the history of ADA, and I have one on the history of wheelchair tennis. But we're really excited to have you here. And I also want to let you know that the SHAPE conference is happening in Minneapolis April 6th to April 9th. I'm going to be there doing a presentation, so come on by if you want to meet me. I'm doing one on disability sports in a general physical education class. So we're going to get started. We're going to talk about behavior management with adaptive physical education. We're going to talk about collaboration in there, and we're going to talk about sensory integration in this episode, and then the next episodes we're going to talk a little bit more with those. So I want to welcome some of our guests, and really excited because we have some really great guests this time. We always do, but this is exceptional guests. So the first one is we have Celine Viajar. And she was a special education ASD teacher in the Portland public schools, and now she's an autism specialist there and is kind of a behavioral consultant. So we're extremely happy to have her. We also have Dr. Lavay, Barry Lavay, who's a professor at the Department of Kinesiology at California State University in Long Beach. And he trains APE teachers and PE teachers, and his specialty is in positive behavior management in physical activity settings. He actually has a new book who he wrote with one of my mentors, Dr. French. And this is the 3rd edition. It's brand new, and I got it just for this interview, and it's fantastic. Has a ton of resources, ideas, and he's done a lot of research on behavior management in the field of physical activity and kids with disabilities. And our last guest, this is kind of a cool thing too, is he's our first reoccurring guest, and that's Brad Weiner. If you remember, he was on our 3rd episode. And Brad is the National Teacher of the Year in 2013 from SHAPE, and he's on the board of every single thing that is applicable in our field. The National Consortium, he's the vice president. He's the president of the Adaptive Physical Education Maryland board, and he came to me actually about doing this podcast because he said he did a needs survey for APE teachers in the state of Maryland, and they said the number one need was behavior management, which I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about in a moment. And we're super excited to have this podcast right now on behavior management. I think behavior management is something that everyone has to deal with if they're teaching, or I think there's a lot of different areas. So physical activity, if you're just teaching physical activity out in the private sector as well, sometimes you have to deal with behavior management issues. But it's a huge need, and I'm going to let Brad talk a little bit about what he knows about that need.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'm currently the president of the Maryland Adaptive Physical Education Consortium, and in the fall we conducted a statewide need survey, and from that survey the results indicated that the physical education teachers and adaptive physical education teachers really wanted more professional development in the area of behavioral intervention strategies. They found that to be the area that they were struggling in, and that they really needed that professional development. So I'm thankful that you brought us together here to have a conversation. So appreciate it.
Well, this is Barry Lavay, and just to piggyback off of that, I was involved in a study with Ron French and Hester Henderson. We looked at 90 AP teachers from around the country, and one of the things that they said, there were a number of questions we asked them regarding behavior management, but one of the things they said was they want more in-services in behavioral interventions, behavior management in general. The only type of if they did have any type of in-service and behavior management, it was on crisis intervention. And they wanted other strategies, and a lot of them felt like they had to learn behavior management on the job. And a lot of them, we were involved in another study where we looked at what are PETE programs, physical education teacher education programs, doing as far as behavior management. And a lot of teachers felt like they weren't always getting the training that they needed. Some felt that they were, but there were some strategies that they needed. So this kind of reinforces what Brad is saying and in these studies.
When you're talking about, it's this huge need, and I've heard this at many conferences. I've heard that, it's the number one reason why beginning teachers leave the job is because of behavior management issues. I've heard these things, and I know it's a well-documented thing. Why have we not been able to successfully tackle it as a field?
Well, I personally, I think, and this is something that I feel strongly about, is that we believe that behavior management is part of pedagogy, and a lot of times, one of the surveys that we did, when we looked at the pedagogy and looked at what they were receiving, a lot of times they're looking at lots of things: how to develop lesson plans, how to teach, how to do instruction, and so behavior management is just one piece of that. And so they're not always getting the training that they need, and if they do get some theory, are they going out in the schools and getting to practice that behavior management before they actually go out and teach? So I think that's one of the issues. Now, there's some schools that are doing a fine job of training teachers to do that, but others, and once they get out there, a lot of problems, a lot of situations are unique, and many of them feel like they don't have all the strategies that they need. You need a big toolbox of many, many skills available to you. That's what I would share.
To what you were saying, a lot of them, I can speak to myself. I didn't have a lot of experience when I started the workforce. But over the years, I built my toolbox. I built the strategies that would support. And I got a better understanding of how to plan an environment that would support them. So yeah, experience is huge.
Right. And the other thing I would share is that appropriate behavior just doesn't automatically occur. I think sometimes a lot of students, when they're in teacher training, they just think, okay, these good behaviors will just automatically occur. And many children will listen to instruction, but there's some children, especially children with special needs, that they're challenging, and they need to be ready and have some training with that. But experience certainly is an issue, but we should also be training them so they're ready for this.
So let's talk a little bit about that beginning stage of, or should be a beginning stage of behavior management, and what we're learning about in our classes, our college courses, which is the philosophy that goes behind behavior management. Let's talk a little bit about that philosophy, maybe some of your philosophies that you have, and then what does that mean to somebody that's actually out in the field? What does that?
One of the things I try to do with my students is I talk to them about philosophy is important because it's a roadmap. It's going to help you look and examine your teaching. You need a roadmap. It's going to guide you in your teaching, and you need a roadmap for behavior management. And one of the things that I think is important is you to start with a continuum, and you start looking at being proactive. What kinds of preventive strategies am I going to develop to work with my students? And from there, I'm going to go with what kinds of strategies am I going to use that are positive to increase their good behaviors, but realizing that you're going to have children that are going to act inappropriately. And third is what type of behaviors and what kind of skill set do I have to work with children that are challenging, that have inappropriate behaviors? How do I redirect those behaviors? And that these good behaviors just don't always automatically occur. And so that's where you start, and you start with this idea that you start to develop some type of philosophy that you're going to work with, and you start to implement that. I learned quickly in my career, like we were just talking about, that if I can't manage behavior, I can't teach. And I want to make it a positive experience for me. I want to make it a positive experience for my students. So you need to go in there with a plan and develop some type of continuum, realizing that even if you go in with a plan, there's still some things that you're going to need to do.
For me, I feel like there needs to be an understanding that you're not by yourself, and it's should be a collaborative approach. So oftentimes, if I'm struggling in my environment, a lot of physical educators may not step forward to collaborate with other teachers and to see if maybe the classroom teacher is having a similar issue, or maybe the classroom teacher has already addressed this issue with certain strategies that I could use in my environment. And so I feel it's very important for any teacher, when thinking about behavior, to really think of a collaborative approach and to be open to talk. And they may not come to talk to you, but you need to leave your gym and go and talk to some other teachers, the educational team. Going along with that also, it's also very important that I know my students as individuals and not just know my class as a whole. But one student with individual may benefit from one strategy where another student may benefit from a different strategy. So I really have to know my students as individuals.
So I agree with both of you. Having a platform or a philosophy of, in terms of classroom management or behavior management, and also the collaborative approach. A lot of times, like the first year teachers are always afraid of asking for help. And so that's one thing that's missing, asking for help, asking for support, for feedback. And then knowing your students. They forget about that. Once they come in the classroom, they immediately jump to like teaching lessons without thinking that you have to establish a classroom expectations, or having that solid plan for behavior management before teaching your students the skills.
Scott, I just want to reinforce what Brad and Celine said. Collaboration is really critical, and I think a lot of PE teachers feel like, oh, this is a sign of weakness if I ask for help. The first thing they should do is find out, is there a school-wide behavior intervention plan going on in their school? That should be the first thing. And if there's not, they should be going to that special ed teacher or that classroom teacher and say, they know that child best. They see that child all day, and what kind of strategies are you working on, and how can we work together, and how can we collaborate? But that takes an effort. That takes walking out of the gym, making an effort to meet with that special ed teacher. So that's critical. The last piece that they said, if I was going to pick one thing, whether it's behavior management or it's effective teaching, you've got to connect with your students. You've got to find out what's idiosyncratic to them, what motivates them. And that takes time. And there's a lot of different ways that we can explore that you can talk, that we could talk about that. It could be as simple as sending notes home to their parents and saying, tell me what your child likes to do at home. What activities does your child do at home? What activities do you do as a family? Talk to that special ed classroom teacher. Maybe there's a behavioral interventionist on your campus or in your school district. And so talk to them. But connecting with students is number one. Is you have to connect. And the point Celine made is new teachers are so hung up on, and they're drilled in school about, they got to get their lesson plans correct.
What Celine was just talking about, she touched on, setting those expectations. And I think that's, it's a topic that I definitely wanted to hit on. How do you establish your expectations? What are the first steps? And then how do you keep those expectations relevant throughout the year? And what does that look like specifically for PE?
Well, the way that I would look at that is expectations are your rules. I like the term expectations because then students know these are what is expected of them. And I think the first thing you need to do is you need to ask yourself, as a teacher, what are your expectations? What do you want students to do? If I was to teach a class, I would like my students, for example, to listen to instruction. I would like them to respect equipment. I would like them to share and do their best and be respectful of others. And so I would make those into simple rules. And I think you need to have no more than 5 or 6 expectations, because they can't handle more than that. And maybe if you can come up with a catchy acronym or something that they can hang their hat to and understand, that's important. But to the point, you need to post them. They need to be visual. You need to, the other thing I would say is you need to go over them and teach expectations, just like you would teach somebody how to dribble a basketball. It's a skill, and you've got, just because you did that during your orientation period in September, you need to revisit it later in the year, especially when they come back from vacation. Like when they come back from Brad's spring break, right? You got to review them, and to the point where it's a routine. I would say that first 2 weeks is having that orientation period, and so that they understand these expectations, these routines. That would be what I would share.
That's exactly it. And what I often do is start a year off with playing a game where it is directed to where they should be for instruction, or how I gain attention. So it may be moving around the environment, and then I use my signal of attention constantly. They freeze, or they do a task, and then they keep moving. But I am training them in order to listen to what my signal of attention is, so that throughout the year, whenever I use this form of signal, they know what my expectation is. And so I'm putting it into a lot of game format in the beginning of the year. And you're right, after a long break, it's good to review it and go over it. But I also need to, talking about the expectations, and the way I deliver it should be in a meaningful way to the students, and a method that they comprehend material. So that goes back to me knowing how the students are comprehending material. Some visually, some auditorily, some through movement. So I need to know this and then present my expectations in this format.
Great point. Especially checking for understanding, and what type of learner are they? Are they auditory? Are they visual? How do they learn? And reviewing these rule expectations with them, and visual, when they walk in, they see them.
Is that are you suggesting somewhat for behavior management that with learning styles, that if we're not reaching their learning styles, that could be a reason that some of those behaviors are manifesting?
Of course. And that's just good pedagogy. Yeah.
I want to go back now for a moment to what we talked about a little while ago about collaboration and how important that is. And this is one of my research topics is collaboration. I strongly agree it needs to be in every aspect of our daily lives, collaboration. And I think it helps so much. But what is, how do we collaborate on a regular basis? How do we collaborate for those BIP, behavior intervention plans? And I want to know for Celine. Celine is an autism specialist, a consultant in schools, and I want to know, how do you eventually get into play for our students? Because I know I had to go through. I had some high need behavioral students, and I know it took me a long time to get in connection with one of my consultants like that. And it might have helped me if I had a direction to get to with that person a little faster.
I think one biggest challenge is the time constraint, finding a way for the IEP team members to set a date and time to talk about the behavior of concern. And another thing is a lot of team members are hesitant to develop or get into the FBA or the BIP process because it's very complex and time consuming, and there's a lot of paperwork to be completed. So as an autism specialist, I make sure that there is, usually the case manager is the lead FBA in developing that. And she or he is the one who sets a date and a time for everyone to meet. Emails are usually the the easiest way for us to collaborate. And then we assign each member of the team to, let's say, okay, the teacher will be the one conducting or collecting the data in the classroom. And then the APE teacher or the PE teacher will be the one collecting data for this target of behavior of concern during PE. So every member of the team has a role and a timeline. And after that, we meet and assess, what are the next steps for this FBA or the BIP.
So for me as a physical educator, I may not know Celine. I may not know that she may even exist. But what I can do is go to that special education teacher, talk to the special education teacher about my concerns, and the special education teacher may say, yeah, I'm having the same concerns. I'm meeting with Celine. And then as a physical educator, I would say, well, I would like to join you with this meeting so that I can be part of this process and that I can take data as well so that I could, one, know this, what is happening and what is being looked at. I'm taking data within my own room. And then when we talk about the behavior plan, I am part of that behavior plan and I know it very well because I was part of the process of developing it so that I can implement it into my surrounding.
One point I'd like to share is some physical educators, a lot of times they feel overwhelmed, and special ed could perhaps reach out to them and say, here's a checklist of behaviors, and when so-and-so is included, when this child is included into general PE, can you check off, and it could be very quickly something that they could check off on a rubric, their behaviors, and that way you have this open line of communication going back and forth when that child goes to physical education, and that's one easy way. But I think the point is made that sometimes you hear functional behavior assessment and you hear this behavior intervention plan, and there is a lot of paperwork involved in that. And but the physical educator needs to reach out and say, hey, how can I get involved? And it's just going to make things a lot easier for everyone involved.
And just for my listeners, just so they're aware, because I don't think we are always aware of behavioral consultants and such, that Celine's in Portland public schools, but her position should be at just about every public school around. So they are there for us. All right. So let's talk a little bit about those learning styles again. What does that look like for some different types of disabilities, and how do we what's the nitty gritty? Tell me exactly, how do we reach those learning styles within PE? Let's go through visual, auditory, kinesthetic. How do we reach those learning styles?
I think one thing that we also have to remember whenever a student has an IEP, for every member of the team, including the gen ed teachers or the PE teachers, is to know the accommodations and modifications on the IEP. Because a lot of times, teachers would call us and say, hey, we have a problem, we need you to come in and look at the behavior of the student. And then forgetting that, have we put the accommodations or modifications for that setting in place? And those accommodations, they include behavioral supports. So that's one thing that also the team needs to consider.
I would say that, this is, although it's behavior management, we're also talking about just good pedagogy, is that finding out what kind of learner the student is, and if they're a visual learning, using more visuals and working with that classroom teacher, a special ed teacher is critical. Maybe they're a kinesthetic learner and you're going to use physical guidance. Maybe you're going to reach out and have a peer tutor that's going to help them. And so there's just, this just gets into good teaching, differentiated instruction, having a rubric with task variation. Those are all effective strategies that work, and I'm sure Brad uses a lot of those every day,
Yeah, I have some students that may be advanced in one area, and a way that I can use them is to provide that peer instruction or peer helping. If they can teach the skill that is more advanced than them performing it. So here I am meeting their needs in order to advance their learning to teach somebody else, but also giving one-on-one support to a student that may be struggling. And so it goes into, again, knowing my students and then using them to where they are able to continue to learn and challenge themselves, but also where everybody's able to move forward. And one thing is that if I don't use my students that are really skilled very well, then they may get bored and I may have a behavioral issue on my hands. So knowing how to keep them challenged is very important as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the whole idea of when they become a peer tutor, now they're taking ownership, and that can be extremely motivational, and that just gets into, they just feel fulfilled by helping out, and that gets into that whole piece of self-responsibility and what we're trying to do with a lot of our students. So I think that's great.
But going back to the sensory implications, a student may come into my room and start to struggle. And I have to know, is it because there's a loud sound? Or is it because it's too light in the environment? Or do they need some vestibular motion to get out some energy right in the beginning? So I really need to go and know how is my environment impacting the student's learning, and is it impacting the student's learning visually, tactilely, or auditorily?
Yeah, along the lines of sensory, I think it's really important to find out what is going on sensory and wise with that child, and talking to, again, the special ed classroom teacher, the parents, maybe a note home. Most importantly, that's what OTs do. That's what occupational therapies, they do a lot of sensory, finding out what's going on. And maybe, as Brad said, examining your gym. Gyms can be challenging settings. They're open, there's a lot of noise, there's lots of lines, and how do you best try to structure your environment so there's consistency, and that just gets into being proactive and having a consistent environment, a structured environment, and how important that is. And that leads into that whole sensory, and not being afraid to do sensory breaks. And if the child needs a sensory break, and that's really critical. And one of the things I share with my university students, if you're going to get 15 really good minutes out of this child, and by trading off a 1 minute sensory break, it's worth it. And it might be as simple as having them just step out for a minute and do a self timeout, and then come back in and join the group.
Real quick, I want to ask, just for our listeners, when we say sensory break, what is a sensory break?
Well, it could be a lot of things, but it could be as simple as just a self timeout where you go outside and you just get away from the environment. But it could also be something like there's something that that you need to manipulate. It depends on the child. And I've seen AP teachers that'll work with a child for 15, 20 minutes, and then they can go for a sensory break and work with something. There are many, many things that are sensory, that can be used for sensory.
I may have a student that may leave the environment with a paraeducator, go for a walk around the hallway, and come back. When I was teaching general physical education, I had a student in first grade who had a lot of sensory needs. And in terms of a sensory break, I did just that. I set up a hula hoop in the corner of my gym with a small 6-foot parachute. And if he was able to take sensory breaks on his own, if he felt that things were becoming overwhelming, he went over to the hula hoop, he sat in the hula hoop, he put the parachute over his head, and he calmed himself down, and he would return back to the class. If for some reason he sat there for too long, I would go over and have a conversation with him to try to pull him back in. But oftentimes he was a student that was able to take a sensory break on his own, where by putting the parachute over his head, it took away the whole environment, and he was able to calm himself down.
Just one last thing about sensory breaks, Scott, is I think for a lot of, if it's an inclusion setting and for general PE teachers, this is sort of foreign to them. And so we need to, as APE teachers and the classroom teacher, explain this concept of sensory breaks. And, because they're used to teaching, and then all of a sudden you've got to be real flexible with some of these concepts.
With sensory integration and implications, I want to touch on that a little bit more. And we have the two types of sensory integration issues. We have hypo and hyper sensitivity, and I've had the pleasure of seeing Temple Grandin speak on the issue twice now, and I'm very happy I've seen her. And she explained it as everyone has a cup, and that cup gets filled, and those are different. We have a different cup for every sensory system, vestibular or tactile. We each have a different cup, and for some of us, we have different size cups, and either we have really small cups and they get filled up really quick and they start to overflow. And those are hypersensitive kids, and they get too much stimulation too quickly. And we have ones that have really big cups. They have big gulps from 7-Eleven, and they never get filled. So we talked a little bit about assessing or finding out our kids and what sensory issues they have. How do we find out what their sensory input issues are, especially if they have communication issues?
It was mentioned earlier that to speak with the OT and ask if the OT can look at the child and conduct a sensory profile assessment and identify what are the different kinds of sensory difficulties does this child have and how do we address this. And another for a classroom teacher, I usually do, when I was teaching, the first few weeks of, classes, I would do an assessment, whereas I would be able to provide different sensory input and be able to assess, okay, does this child gravitate towards the tactile materials, or does this child a visual learner, or does this child need a compression vest? Does the child need a joint pressure or joint compression? So I think for the teachers is to have that assessment, but be careful of what kind of input you're providing. And another information that you can get is from the special ed teachers, for the PE teachers, and also asking the parents, doing a parent interview. Those are really good information that you can get from.
It goes back to that collaboration, and occupational therapists and physical therapists are other people part of the team to collaborate with. In this sense, the occupational therapist would be a great resource. And then once identifying those needs, the occupational therapist will also be able to provide strategies to use within the environment to meet the needs. Does this student need some deep pressure opportunities, or does this student need less pressure, less tactile input?
All right, APE listeners, that will be it for today. Expect the next episode to be out very shortly, as I have 2 more episodes on behavior management to come out, and I have another 1 or 2 on history to come out. So expect those to be coming out about every week or every other week. All right, have a great day, and I hope you enjoy your Easter.